During the next few sessions, we're going to be looking at managing users and groups in BSD Unix. Now there are several different functions that we can perform with users and groups, such as adding users, managing their accounts, adding groups, adding users to those groups, and changing passwords, and in general just managing the user profiles and so forth. So we're going to be looking at all that through the next few sessions. For this session, what we want to look at is how to add a user to the Unix box, how to add a group, and how to affect password changes for those users. Now we've been logging in as the root user primarily, but that's normally not a good idea on a day-to-day basis, as we'll see as we go through the course, because of security issues. So we want to have other user accounts on the box as well. We want to be able to establish each user with their own home directory, with their own functions, with their own privileges, permissions, and so forth, for accountability reasons as well. Let's go ahead and take a look at adding a user to a Unix box and some other functions as well. Okay, we're at our FreeBSD virtual machine, and I'm going to log in as root, and we want to be able to manage our users. So what we want to do is add a user. Now let's look at the add user command. And as you can see, the add user command has a great many options and so forth, switches that we can use with this command. It's great to have all this, and you can learn what each of these switches do, but they've actually made it fairly easy for you. If you want, you can assign these different switches and their arguments and so forth, but it might be a little bit easier just to simply run the add user command, and you'll get prompted for all this information. For example, our username. Let's go ahead and go with a user called Barbara, and we'll make her full name Barbara Smith. It will prompt us to input the UID, or user ID. Normally, unless you have a reason for assigning a specific UID, leave this at the default. Let the system assign it, because it has a way of assigning them in certain orders. We can change the login group, or we can leave that at the default. Let's go ahead and leave it at the default for now, and we don't have to invite her to other groups just yet. This gives you a good amount of control over creating the initial user account, but there might be some things, such as adding to groups, that you might want to do later as we go. The same thing with login class. Now we can go with the typical shell, the C shell, but let's go ahead and make her login shell bash, and we're going to leave her home directory at /home/Barbara. Normally it will be the username in the home directory, or in some BSD distributions /usr/home, and we're going to leave the default directory permissions. And yes, we want them to be able to use a password, and we don't want them to use a blank password, but we also don't want to assign a random password. We want to assign the password, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and type in a password so that we can give this to them and they can log in using this password, and we'll make it a good secure password as well. We can choose to lock the account out if we like, but let's choose not to, because we want them to log in immediately. If you think the user is not going to log in for a while, you might want to lock it. And then it gives you basically a summarization of what you've typed in, and gives you the option to say yes or no as far as it's okay, and we're going to do that. And from this point we can add another user if we like. We're going to say no. Now, one thing you can do with add user is you can put in a user account file that has many users and their parameters using this command, and it will add users in batch, so you can do many users at a time if you like, rather than just going through this one after a time. Now the next thing we want to look at is the etc password file. Now the etc password file is a file that goes back a ways in Unix, and originally that's where all user account information, including the password, was stored. And as you can see, it's a little bit difficult to read sometimes, but once you know how it works out fairly well. Look at the very bottom of the file, and that's the most current user we added, the user Barbara, with a UID of 1503 and a group ID of 1503, and that's what it was assigned by the system. We've got her full name, her home user directory, and her shell, and that's the basics that you get out of the etc password file. Used to be, where that little star was, you also had the password in there, but this file is readable by all users, and it has to be, because you have to be able to do certain things that use the etc password file. So passwords are not stored in here anymore. As a matter of fact, now they're stored in what's called the shadow file. On most Linux distributions and some Unix distributions it's called etc shadow. On FreeBSD it's called etc/master.passwd password. And we can take a look at that. If you look down the bottom, once again, you'll see the most recent user added, and you can see the password there right after her username, but it's not the password we typed in. It's been encrypted. It uses a seed to encrypt using whatever algorithm is set up by default in the system, and that's the encrypted version of it. Now only root can read that master password file or the etc shadow file on other Unix systems, so you don't have to worry about someone grabbing the password hashes and breaking the password. But like I said, on BSD it's called etc/master.password. On most other Unix and Linux systems it's etc shadow. Now one thing we can do as a user is we can change our own password just by typing password, and if I just type this in, that would allow me to change the password of whoever's logged in, me for example, the root user. But if I am root, I can change another person's password just by typing their username, password Barbara, and then it will let me change the password if I like. So if they get locked out or they don't remember their password, I can change it for them. Now as far as groups go, there are in some Linux distributions and Unix versions the ability to change groups from the command line, and in fact on most GUIs there's the ability to change users and groups in the GUI. In BSD Unix, the version that we're using now, FreeBSD, most of the way you can do that is to simply look at the etc group file, and you can see the different groups that are in there, and we have a group for each user and also other groups that can be in there. And what you might want to do just for this is to simply add a group, simply edit this file in a typical text editor such as VI and add the group you like and know what GID or group ID you'd like to use. And it's actually that simple to do that with etc group in a BSD system. Now again, there are other tools to do this. If you're in Linux or if you're in a GUI, you can use the tools that are available to you. But this is a very simple way to do it, to add a group there. And of course you want to add the group before you create a user and add it to that group so that the group exists. So we've just looked at a few quick ways to modify, to add users and groups, modify their settings, and where those settings are stored. And in later sessions we'll get a little bit more in depth into how to modify the user account and its profiles.